Raising voices. A rallying cry across the country and here at home, sparked by the killing of George Floyd.
We made a point to stop here tonight to show that this is a peaceful protest and that it is possible.
And now, cries for change, from protest to plans. Voices united.
It feels like home. It feels like America.
And good evening, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us for this 8 on Your Side special, Voices United, a real conversation about race. I'm Rod Carter.
And I'm Jennifer Lee. We have seen a shift in this country unlike we've seen before. The killing of George Floyd led people to the streets to protest.
And it led them to the table for talks. Tonight, 8 on Your Side is taking a look at race, racial justice, and racial inequality.
They're the images that grabbed our attention.
Images that seem like they belonged somewhere far away.
The heartache.
The tension.
The fear.
The violence.
But they weren't someplace else. This was playing out right here.
In our own neighborhoods, on our own streets.
A collision of the past and the present. A story told across the country once again.
One of racial inequality, of police brutality.
A society, maybe, just maybe,
Finally ready to say, enough is enough, with Voices United.
It started with his story, one echoed so many times before.
But this time, something is different. George Floyd's death, the rebirth of a movement.
Uniting ideals, encouraging a brutally honest dialogue.
And hopefully, igniting real change.
And joining us tonight to talk about these issues, St. Petersburg Police Chief Anthony Holloway.
Lorenz Johnson, who hit the streets in protest and ended up behind bars. Tampa Police Chief Brian Dugan is also with us as well.
And the president of the Hillsborough branch of the NAACP, Yvette Lewis, is joining us as well. We're going to begin tonight, though, with you, Lorenz. Tell us a little bit about the reason why you went out in protest in the first place. What was your hope?
I went out in protest with the hope and with the belief that we as citizens in the United States could come together in solidarity and stand behind the family of George Floyd and that brutal murder, as well as the family of Breonna Taylor, whose murderers are still out there. I went out with the hope and the belief that our justice system will actually seek justice and not be biased and not show the traditional stigma that we have seen across the country with our criminal justice system.
Do you feel like you accomplished that goal in what you and the other protesters were out there doing?
No, I think it's going to be probably a lifetime work. I think it's just the beginning. It's just the initiation and something that will continue. My parents, my grandparents were all protesters. My grandparents protested with Dr. King. And so I think it's just something that will continue on probably for the rest of my life and my future children until change actually takes place.
And part of the success of your messaging and your intentions protesting and those of your parents and grandparents involves a dialogue with law enforcement. And, you know, Chief Dugan, you are with TPD, and I know that it was a bumpy road in the beginning with protesters, but how do you think things have gone in recent weeks, and what changes have you made in listening to these conversations?
Well, we've tried to be more patient and more open-minded in our approach to things, and we've worked with so many of the protests and so many of the marches. And and you're right, it started off a little bumpy. We had a rough time of things, but I think now cooler heads are prevailing and people are working together. But there's still a lot of changes as police, not only in Tampa but across the nation. We have to do a better job of listening and working with our communities.
Chief Holloway, I want to ask you, because you have a unique perspective. Not only are you an African-American man, but you are the head of one of the Bay Area's largest police departments. So you hear this conversation, you have a vantage point unlike a lot of folks. How do we bridge this divide between law enforcement and the community members who feel like their voices have gone unheard for generations?
I think we have to continue these conversations that we're having, but along with these conversations, we have to put action steps into place because, like Mr. Johnson said, everybody is tired of these conversations. We have a conversation. If we end up where we are a month from now, still having a conversation, then we're never going to move forward. I like what I see with a lot of the chiefs that are out there. Chief Dugan working with the people out there. We're working with people out there. And you know what? Let's find out where the problem is. Let's address these concerns. Let's get our officers in the community trained so we can be better in addressing these issues that are in front of us right now.
And Chief Holloway, speaking specifically to that with officer training, I mean, there has been a lot of aggressive talk about defunding the police or rerouting some of that funding into areas that have more to do with training the officers or training someone who's not a police officer to deal with issues that may not end up with someone going to jail. How do you address that in law enforcement so that, as to your point, it's not just talk?
Well, you know, everybody keeps saying that word defunding. No one's looking to defund the police department. I think everybody's looking at how can we use our resources better to make sure that we can get more resources into the community. And we're doing that right now. We're looking at what calls can we go on that a civilian can handle. We've been talking about it for years in the police department, so I'm going to say it's time to stop talking about it. Why are police department, our police officers going on call they shouldn't be going on? Why can't we have other people address those calls? You know, we keep saying we don't want to arrest our way out of a situation. Well, let's stop talking about that. Let's start doing something about that. Let's find a professional that can handle those calls that police officers shouldn't be going on.
And Yvette, you know, one of the things that came up a lot too is the Citizens Review Board, especially for the Tampa Police Department. And you held a news conference that said we need to revamp this board, give this board teeth. Do you feel like anything has changed in that regard?
It really doesn't have the teeth that we're looking for. One of the things that we're asking for it to be taken from up underneath the mayor and put in the hands of the city council and the number of people that are appointed to the board. So it's a work in progress. I do know that the mayor has made some changes, but it's just very small and minute changes. And it's just not sitting well with the community. And that board is there to put the trust back in the community so we can have a place to go to voice the concerns that we're having with law enforcement.
Very quickly, do you feel like we're on the right track to having these conversations and making some systemic change?
I do feel we are on the right track. I do feel that we are making steps towards the right direction. You know, it's just the fact that we all want action and we want action now. But I understand that some things, you know, dealing with legal, it takes a little bit more time. But, you know, but we are on the right tracks. And I feel like everybody wants this thing that we're going through to end and help and better serve this community. So that's what we're here for.
Thank you all. We really appreciate your time tonight. So thank you so much for taking part in this. All right.
Thank you.
Still to come tonight, where do we go from here?
From protests to partnerships, people are looking for ways to bridge the divide. We continue our discussion tonight with Voices United in a real conversation about race.
And welcome back to our 8 on Your Side special, Voices United, a real conversation about race.
I'm Jennifer Lee.
And I'm Rod Carter. So glad you can stay with us. For the second part of this discussion, we want to take a look at what needs to happen now, moving forward. And we're joined by some leaders in our community. First off, James Ransom from the Tampa Organization of Black Affairs. Thank you very much for being here. As well as Dr. Rafael Fuentes from Hillsborough Community College.
That's right. We also have with us Freddie Barton, the Executive Director of Safe and Sound Hillsborough, whose goal is to work together to build strong families, safe schools, and healthy neighborhoods. And Reverend Kenny Irby from historic Bethel AME Church in St. Petersburg and the Director of Community Intervention and Juvenile Outreach for the city of St. Pete. Reverend Irby, I want to start with you. How much progress in recent weeks do you think there has been made, particularly here in the Bay Area, as so many voices have come together calling for change?
I think there's been tremendous progress, and yet it's not enough. There are a lot of rich conversations that are happening. The protest has elevated some primary concerns that were exposed primarily by COVID-19, but we have not gotten to where we need to be.
You know, one of the interesting things, I think all of us would agree, we've all probably done about 50, 60 Zoom panel discussions about this topic. And one of the things that I heard the other day is that, Dr. Fuentes, we need not allies in the fight, but accomplices, people who are going to get in there and do the work right alongside everyone. So in your role with HCC, what have you seen in being able to be an accomplice and kind of work to make some systemic changes when it comes to race relations?
When it comes about building in these relations, one of the things that we do mostly over here in our community at HEC is to do a mentoring program, helping the minority groups to really make them to be successful and also complete their degree, which is such an important component nowadays.
James, how has TOBA been able to move this conversation forward, move the needle forward when it comes to repairing some of the systemic problems that we have, and not just in this community, but really across the country?
We tend to focus on results-oriented ideas and not so much on the symptoms, which we see in the form of frustration expressed in protests and some nonviolent protests, civil unrest. We think the problem really is unemployment, inequality, injustice, hopelessness. So we focus on solutions to address the actual problems. And so what we've been able to do is our conversation with leaders is not so much about helping them craft letters in corporate and organizational statements about supporting Black Lives Matter, as much as looking in the mirror to see where their representation is diverse in their organizations of governance, of leadership, how they spend money and employ a diverse group of people. And so we're in agreements with a lot of organizations that are moving on solving the actual problem. That's the only way to address what's going on and what we're seeing now in the form of frustration.
James, I want to stay with you for just a moment. You know, obviously a very significant election is coming for us in November. How much significance does that play in the success of a movement?
Well, you know, TOBA is a nonpartisan organization, nonprofit organization, but we meet with all of the candidates for offices in the state, local, and federal government levels. And we discuss things that they need to commit to doing. And so what we need from them is not, again, a soundbite for an election or to just stay in office. We need for them to actually represent taxpayers, some of whom look like people of color, obviously. In Tampa, the population in the geography of Tampa is 24% African American and 25% Hispanic. You can't ignore 49% of the electorate. You have to respond to be sensitive to the special interests of that group, the special groups. So I think what we look for is action, and we want results and commitments. And so that's what we focus on.
And Freddie, you're right there in the community and you're working, hands-on with young people to make some of these changes. What are you hearing from them about what we're seeing now and where we need to go?
You know, one of the things, especially with our young boys, they're having conversations saying that they're not being heard right now, that it's all about, the adults are fighting, the adults are doing this, but I've had conversations saying, look, we just want to be heard. We want our opinions to matter. We want to be part of the conversations. There's a lot of community conversations going on. Their organizations are putting on different events, but we're not listening to our young people. And they're the ones that are going to be able to fix the things that we as adults have broken. And so they want to be more involved in the process of moving the community forward.
And we want to continue this conversation as well, gentlemen. We so appreciate you taking a few minutes with us to answer some of our questions. And we commit to you, we will continue talking about this. Thank you.
Absolutely. We'll do our part and everyone else will do theirs. Thank you so much. We're going to take a quick break and we'll be right back with more of this conversation on Voices United. In the nation's capital, the words Black Lives Matter were painted in giant yellow letters that led up to the street that leads up to the White House. And that leads us up to our final panel discussion. What policy steps need to be taken to affect real change? And
joining us for that discussion are three lawmakers on every level: U.S. Representative Kathy Castor, State Senator Darrell Roussan, and Hillsborough County Commissioner Chair Les Miller.
Thank you guys so much for being with us. We really appreciate you. I want to start with you, if I could, for just a moment, Darrell. We want to talk about what real steps need to be taken to make some change. But one of the rallying cries that we heard a lot during protests over the last several months is defund the police. Kind of explain what that means and if that's something that could possibly happen or should it happen?
Well, I can tell you what it means to me. It means strategic funding of the police, increased de-escalation training increased recruitment, increased accountability and transparency through body cams and training. I'm not for defunding the police department. I'm for strategic funding for things that will help us in this justice outcry.
Congresswoman Castor, I wonder from the congressional standpoint, what do you think has to happen from a legislative standpoint to begin to execute real change?
Well, the House of Representatives passed the George Floyd Justice in Policing Act just a couple months ago. It was a piece of legislation that helped reimagine how we do policing here in America. It did a couple of very important things: end racial profiling in policing, banning no-knock warrants in drug cases, banning chokeholds, changing the standard to evaluate whether the law enforcement use of force was justified or not, and requires state and local law enforcement agencies to use existing funds to enact body cameras across the Tampa Bay area, across the state of Florida, all across the country. We've seen how body cameras really improve on transparency and help with justice. But it goes beyond policing. It goes to systemic racism in every part of society, in education and healthcare. Unfortunately, our George Floyd Justice in Policing bill, we sent it over to the United States Senate, and they have not taken it up. They offered a weak proposal that was not acceptable. So we've got to march on here.
Well, to your point about systemic racism, what do those of us with white privilege, which is a phrase that we've heard a lot about, what are those of us with white privilege or any kind of privilege, required to or expected to do to really bring about meaningful change and to help those whose voices have gone largely unheard?
I think those of us with white privilege have a responsibility to listen, have a responsibility to act according to our ideals here in the United States of America, to not turn away. I think we've learned here over the past decades that you can bury your head in the sand, but that doesn't do anything to bring justice to this great country. You have to stand up and march on. And, I can't help but think about the late, great John Lewis, who was my colleague in Congress, who recently passed. He said, keep your eye on the prize, never give up, never give in, and march on. And it's a responsibility for everyone. My parents taught me at an early age what it means to be equal and treat everyone with respect, no matter their background or the color of their skin. And parents and schools and all of us have a responsibility to work on equal rights and root out systemic racism.
Commissioner Miller, during the past few months, I know you've had some very impassioned speeches at the County Commission about being an African-American man and in this society. What can your voice and voices like yours do move the needle forward, if you will, in changing policy and in changing systemic racism?
Well, my voice, since I've been on the County Commission, even in the House and the Senate, was to talk about what I've been through. Being a person that was born in the 1950s and going through the segregation movement, just like I told you all a few minutes ago, I went to all segregated schools. And I tried to get members of the County Commission and others to understand the things that I've been through and had to face even in the military. But I think the important part is, and I think that Congresswoman Castor said that, is that we have to listen to each other. And that's the problem we're having today. We're not listening to each other. Being white and privileged is one thing, but having that opportunity to listen to what I have to say and what I've been through and understanding what some of these people are going through now and why we're doing what we're doing, I think that's the part of listening. The demonstrations, the peaceful demonstrations that John Lewis, God bless his soul, was involved in still are happening today. So it's all a point of listening to what is going on and listen to those of us that have faced these systemic racism eyeball to eyeball. That's the important thing. So if you can listen to what I have to say, I listen to what you have to say. We have different points of life. We came up differently. We face things differently. So I'm trying to understand what you're going through and what you see as an issue, but please understand what I see and what I feel the issues are.
We're running out of time, but I want to ask each of you a final question because this is the last segment for this special. Are we on the right track? Are we on the way to making real change in this country? And I'll start with you, Commissioner Miller.
Some of us, but let me say this. As long as someone, as a leader of the free nation, continues to preach segregation and continues to preach separatism, we're not going to get there. We can talk all we want, but as long as someone's sitting there and tries to divide us constantly, day in and day out, it's going to be a long time before we get there.
Senator Rasan?
I think things have improved, but we are not quite there yet. I do believe people are listening. And like Commissioner Miller says, we need to stop those who are preaching division and hatred. But I do think that good things will happen as a result of this justice outcry, including healthcare issues that the scab has been ripped off the wound for the disparate treatment, the disproportionate impact of this pandemic on Black and brown communities. So I do think we'll get there.
And last but not least, Congresswoman Castor.
No, I don't think we're there. And it's a time now to discard the complacency of the past and all people to join together, especially the younger generation who understands the power of change and what needs to happen. And it needs to happen not just for justice and policing, but in healthcare, for environmental justice, in education. I've seen some things here at the local level or at the state level where we've gone backwards. No more going backwards. We've got to rise up and each of us do more than we've been doing in the past to promote equal rights and respect among all.
Thank you all so much for being a part of this discussion today. We really appreciate it.
We appreciate you. And thank you for joining us. We'll be right back in just a moment.
Thanks so much for joining us.
Have a great night.